It's never been this quiet before. I want to thank everybody for coming to join us today for this week's Student Talk Back political policy discussion. For those of you who I haven't had the chance to meet before, my name is Dan Schnurr, and I'm the director of the Jess Unruh Institute of Politics. And we put on these lunches each week in conjunction with several other institutes and centers of policy around the USC campus. We work with the Bedrosian Institute for Public Policy over at the Price School. We work with our friends at the Schwarzenegger Institute over at Price as well. And we work with our friends at the Tomas Rivera Institute. And over the course of the semesters, I think many of you know by now, we take turns putting on these programs examining various aspects of politics, government, and public policy. Today we've got, I think, an especially interesting policy discussion on the issue of education reform. And in particular, for those of you who are so inclined, I have been instructed to tell you that today's conversation, in addition to being videoed, in addition to taking place, of course, in real time and real space, today's conversation will also be live tweeted at #USC.EdReform. Our first tweeted Students Talk Back panel, one other milestone as we edge gradually into the 21st century. Somewhat belatedly, granted. Like I said, we've got a terrific discussion today. The golden state of education, the future of education reform in California. And let me take just a moment to introduce our guests. Sitting way, way down at the other end of the table, where I'm safe from him, is an old friend of mine, Ben Austin. And Ben has worked in politics and governance for many years, but most recently and most notably is the founder and the executive director of Parent Revolution. Ben, thank you so much for coming. Sitting next to Ben is Kat Shea, and as many of you know, Kat is one of the leaders in USC's College Democrats. Kat, thanks so much for being here with us today. Kat brings her fan club. Don't get intimidated.
I try really hard.
Just don't disagree with her and you'll be fine. Sitting next to Kat is Michelle Rhee. Michelle, as many of you know, is the former chancellor of the Washington, D.C. Public Schools and is the founder and CEO of Students First. Join me in welcoming our guest, Michelle Rhee. And after today's program ends, at 1 o'clock, Michelle will be signing copies of her new book, Radical, Fighting to Put Students First. And for those of you who have the time and inclination, it's a tremendous book, and I'd encourage you to stop by, get a copy, and have a chance to chat at least briefly with Michelle about today's conversation. And finally, last but certainly not least, representing the College Republicans is Haran Sivakumar. Haran, thank you so much for coming today. We appreciate it. All right, so we're going to get started on the questions, and as is our custom, as I think all of you know, is I'll ask questions for roughly the first half of the program, and then we'll open it up to questions from all of you. So at about 1:30, we'll get to your questions, but in the meantime, listen to what these guys have to say, and if something comes to mind, we'll make sure we'll do everything we can to get to you between 12:30 and 1 o'clock. Michelle, I'm gonna start with you, and there's any number of topics on which we can start, but one that's been in the news particularly recently is the report card that your organization Students First has put out, ranking the various states in the country as to the progress they're making in terms of education reform and educational excellence. And the state of California, if my notes tell me right, received an F. Now, I didn't see any A's on your curve, which means most of the people sitting in the audience here will never ever take a class from you because they don't like professors who don't give A's. I've learned the hard way. But there's some B minuses, a lot of C's, a few D's, and then some F's. I guess the logical place to start this conversation is where reform needs to start and what needs to happen. How did the state of California manage to get an F? And what can the state of California do to move up on the grading curve?
Yep. So that is correct. We are an F, which means that we have nowhere to go but up. That's the good news. When you talk about why, so our report card does not look at the current academic achievement levels of kids or anything like that. It assumes that the academic achievement levels of kids in each state are what they are. And the question that we ask ourselves is, what kind of a policy environment does each state have in place, and how good is that environment, and in what way will it sort of push the trajectory of student achievement up aggressively? So that's what the report card is based on in the 3 areas that we focus on at Students First, which is elevating the teaching profession, empowering parents with choices and options, and spending taxpayer dollars wisely. So those are our 3 areas. I would say that in terms of sort of what the state could do to begin to take the first steps away from the F and on our way to an A, I will sort of encapsulate in 2 quick points. One, when we came out with the report card, there was a quote from a deputy commissioner of education in the state, and he said, "We wear this F as a badge of honor."
Yeah, a couple of my students have tried that before.
And I thought to myself, are you proud of the fact that tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of children in this state are just languishing in failing schools? Are you proud of the fact that we've gone from having the best school district in the country as a state to the worst? I'm not sure what you're proud of exactly, but I would juxtapose that attitude to what we saw in Massachusetts. And this is interesting. So Massachusetts usually is in the #1 position on every single report card that comes out about education in this country, because the academic achievement levels of kids are the highest in Massachusetts. And on our report card, Massachusetts actually gets a D, because again, it's about the policy environment. And the interesting thing was the response that we got from Massachusetts. And the sort of best illustration of that was a joint op-ed that one Republican and one Democratic legislator wrote in the Boston Globe about the F, or about the D, on the report card, in which they said, you know what, we're always used to getting A's, we're always used to being the best, and this is actually a good opportunity for us, because there is still too wide an achievement gap in our state. Even though we're #1, 50% of our kids still aren't proficient. And so this is a good time for us to take a step back and really focus on what we could do better. And when I saw that, I thought, okay, there is no doubt in my mind now of why Massachusetts actually does so much better than California does. That was the first example. The second thing is a very important topic that we are talking about today in this country, and I think we'll talk about a little bit on the panel, is teacher evaluation, and what we're going to do to ensure rigorous and comprehensive evaluations for our educators in the state. One very interesting thing to note is that 38 states in this country have agreed with the federal government to move towards a teacher evaluation model where at least a portion of a teacher's evaluation is based on the academic growth of their children. So 38 states are heading in that direction. One state last year decided that it wanted to head in the opposite direction, and that would be California. So instead of seeing where the nation is going on this front, saying, okay, we have to tie some measure of student achievement into teacher evaluation, there was a bill that was introduced into the California state legislature last year that essentially would have made it illegal to count student achievement into a teacher's evaluation. So that, I think, gives you some sense. I mean, if we could just move a little bit on our attitude and not move backwards, try to move forward, then I actually think it could put us on the right trajectory.
Michelle, thanks so much. I'm gonna go to Kat Shea right now, because Kat, Michelle mentioned a particularly important point in her closing, the key issue of teacher evaluation. And often, as you and I have discussed, too often in politics, policy debates get framed as a series of false choices. In other words, it ought to be all about tests, or there ought to be no testing data available whatsoever. And of course, as you know, life is lived on a slippery slope. And somewhere in between those two extremes, there's a balance. And maybe you can talk about this intricate issue and your thoughts on how to best address it.
I think that when we're talking about teacher tests, or really when we're talking about any bread and butter issue within education policy, it becomes very polarizing automatically. What do you think of teacher tests? I love them, or I hate them. You never really think about trying to strike that balance as you state. What I have seen so far in my classroom observations is that when there are those benchmarks, when there is that increasing pressure to put in value-added models, to use more testing, the effective teachers that I have observed say, one, I'm gonna suck it up because there's nothing I can do at this point. You know, I'm not the policymaker who can really change the way that these tests are administered. So, you know, they have to learn how to use quality instruction time that is engaging for students. It continues curiosity in each child's mind, and it also adheres to those standards. So they're able to just do the test. The second thing that they're able to do that isn't always talked about as often is the ability for the teacher to adjust a child's mind into a testing environment. Because a child can be as smart as they want to be, but if they don't know how to take a test because they just have too much anxiety and too much stress, and they don't have a teacher who's able to lead them effectively and have those kinds of strategies on how to take tests, then what was the point in all of that instructional time? What was the point in all of those tests if they aren't able to understand the child's psychology behind it? I think when we're looking at how those effective teachers are able to use those two prongs effectively, then testing doesn't always seem so bad because, I don't know about you guys, but personally, I don't really see another alternative at this point, right? I'm not really understanding what other ways of accountability there is. You know, it's one of those necessary evils.
And per the conversations you and I have had, Kat, there are other ways, peer evaluation, site visits, that sort of thing. But what I understand you're saying is that the quantitative data needs to be a part of that. Is that your point?
Yes. I think that when we're, when we're talking about, reviewing these tests, we're seeing just this huge influx of data, especially when we're seeing more standards come into play. Not only the process, but the results and what we see in education. But with all this data, I think it's very crucial that we look to school leaders. We look to principals who are managing their school structures effectively in order to filter out all of this data. Because if you just give a teacher all this data, here are your student scores, you're not really leading a teacher on how to improve their instructions. You're not telling a teacher how to manage this data. You're looking at a balance between competition and collaboration, and that's what a teacher needs. Good pressure to motivate them for the next year.
Thanks, Kat. Ben, I want to bring you into this conversation. Now, what I didn't mention in Ben's biography is that he was a member of the California State Board of Education, which means, as near as I can tell, you're complicit in the state of affairs that Michelle has outlined a moment or so ago.
I'm sorry, Michelle.
I'm sure that felt good.
Yeah, it's a long time coming.
But I want to talk about one of the other aspects of this discussion that Michelle raised, albeit briefly, and that's the importance of parent involvement. We have a saying, and some of you have heard me talk about this in other contexts, I like to say that politics is too important to be left to the politicians. And that's not to denigrate our political leaders, but just to say it takes a whole community to line up behind their elected leaders in order to make change happen. And Ben, the impression I've gotten of your organization, of Parent Revolution, is to say the same thing in an education context. Education is too important to be left to the educators. Not to denigrate the educators, but to make it clear there are a lot of other people who have a big stake in this discussion also. Talk a little bit about how you and your organization take on that challenge.
Sure. So in January of 2010, our organization, with the help of a lot of people, including Bonnie Reese, who's sitting in the front row, who was Secretary of Education at the time, helped pass a new law in California called the Parent Trigger. What the Parent Trigger says is that gives parents, any parent in California trapped in a systemically failing school, the power to transform their school through community organizing. If a parent is trapped in a failing school and half the parents sign the petition, they can either bring in new staff, new leadership, or they can turn their school into a charter school, or they can use that as leverage to bargain. Now, to Dan's question, why do parents need this power? there are experts in charge right now, and they're experts. Well, you know, it is a, you talk about kids. You talk about a kids first agenda. You know, politicians do press conferences with kids all the time, and a kids first agenda sounds about as uncontroversial as, you know, apple pie and puppy dogs. But if you really drill down just a little bit, especially in California, you'll find that a kids first agenda is one of the most radical political agendas in this state and in this nation. And fundamentally, the critique against the status quo is that it's failing because it's not even designed to succeed. That it doesn't serve kids because it's not designed to. It's designed to serve the interests of powerful adults. And as Dan said, I was on the State Board of Education for a period of time, but just like Michelle, I lost my job because I was standing up for kids. And at the end of the day, you know, the theory of change that if we just get Michelle Rhee or me or somebody, some other education reformer in the right position, everything's going to be okay, is I think naive, and I think it's a 20th century way of looking at public education and education reform. That fundamentally what the parent trigger movement is all about is a raw and unapologetic transfer of political power from the defenders of the status quo to parents, because they have wholly different incentive structures than everybody else. Everybody on all sides of this issue cares about kids, but parents are the only ones who only care about kids. And so fundamentally, it's a path forward that allows us to break free of a lot of the false choices that have gotten us into this in the first place. That it's not about charter schools versus district schools, or reformers versus teachers unions, or even Democrats versus Republicans. It's about giving parents power over the educational destiny of their own kids.
Ben, thanks very much. And Haran, I want to bring you into this conversation. Ben talks about a lot of things that his organization can do to empower parents, one of which is the reconfiguration of a traditional public school as a charter school. Now, I know you're a supporter of charter schools in California, but I know you also have some concerns about charter schools and their oversight as well. Maybe you can talk a little bit about both your positive thoughts and your concerns on the charter school movement.
So when you look at charter schools, like in the state of California, there's over 1,000 charter schools currently in California. 10% of all public schools are charter schools. So we have no problem opening up charter schools, which is really improving the state of education in our state, because charter schools tend to have twice as likely a high impact on children. They tend to serve lower income communities better by rallying up parents. But if you look at charter schools, low performing charter schools make up around 30% of the charter school education system, and about 40-45% are high performing. And so there's a need to shut down these low performing charter schools, because charter schools were started not only for autonomy, but for accountability, a way to have new ideas, but also to shut down the bad new ideas. And so we really need a way to kind of, with parent improvement, with parent empowerment, to really shut down schools that aren't working, because that's how you empower the schools that are working. That's how you replicate the ideas that are helping communities in a real, sustainable way. And so I think accountability in testing, in parent empowerment is going to be key, because you can't just open up new charter schools with changing current public schools into that state. You have to make sure that they're being accountable, I think, within a smaller time frame too, because if you're going to have radical changes, you need to have radical improvement to accompany that change.
So Ben, I know you want to follow up on this, but let me ask you. Let's assume from the beginning of this conversation that some of the best schools in California are charter schools, and some of the worst schools in California are charter schools. How do you grow the best and eliminate the worst?
Again, as long as the North Star is kids, as long as you're making every decision through the lens of whether you'd make that same decision if it literally affected your own child, it's going to lead you to the right place. And so I know Michelle has taken common sense positions on charter school accountability. When I was in the State Board of Education, I authored the first and the only regulation in the history of the state to shut down the bottom 10% of charter schools every year, because bad charter schools are just as bad for kids as bad district schools. Right now, less than 2 miles from here, the parents at the first LAUSD Parent Trigger Initiative are involved in an historic endeavor. They won a unanimous vote at the LAUSD last week that gives them the power to run a parent-led RFP process to choose a new operator for their school. And so they have 8 suitors. Some of them are charters, one of them is a former teacher, and one of them is the LAUSD. And so the LAUSD right now is competing against a host of charter schools, and the parents are going to vote on who is the best operator to run their school for their children. Parents aren't going to choose a bad plan because they want their kids to do better. And so if there are a number of high-quality charter operators. If a low-performing charter operator applied, I can guarantee you they wouldn't win. The district is competing against charters for the right to run a school that it currently runs. That is a paradigm shift. And it's a paradigm shift that is happening right in your neighborhood. And everybody here can get involved. That's the path forward. And so whether we're talking about charter schools or district schools are bad for kids.
And Michelle, I want to come back to you because one of the greatest differentiators, if not the single greatest differentiator between a bad school and a good school, is the quality of the teacher in the classroom. And you mentioned a few minutes ago the importance of elevating teachers. Now, my own thought on this is that we ought to treat teachers the same way we treat brain surgeons. And our best teachers, like our best brain surgeons, ought to become fabulously wealthy. They ought to become respected, exalted leaders in our community. And our worst teachers, like our worst brain surgeons, ought to be encouraged to do something else for a living. Maybe you can talk a little bit, and we can talk retention and compensation later, but let's start at the beginning. How do you attract a really smart, impressive, hardworking young person into the profession to begin with?
So I was just recently in my house having an argument about, not an argument, but a conversation about this so my husband, who is the current mayor of Sacramento, but he's a former NBA star as well, and are having an interesting conversation, and I said to him as he was watching a basketball game, I said, this is so ridiculous that men who are dribbling a ball around get paid $12 million a year. I understand no value that they are adding to society, honestly. And he was like, hey, that's, see that TV you're watching that month? No. And I said, contrast that with teachers who literally have the most important job in our society, who are literally doing heroic work every day. They are the ones, the best of whom should be getting paid $12 million a year. And I think that when we ask ourselves the question of how do we attract people into this profession, one of the things has to be that nobody goes into teaching for the money. We're all clear on that. But we also know that people who come into this profession, they want to be recognized and rewarded, and they want to be valued for the important work that they're doing. And right now, we don't do that whatsoever in this country. I'll give you a quick example. So in California, there is a state law that mandates that in the time of layoffs, if a school district is seeing a budget crisis, you have to use what is called LIFO, last in, first out. So if you were the last teacher hired, you must be the first teacher fired regardless of performance. What that results in, sometimes, is a situation where a young teacher, and this has happened multiple times in the state of California, will get their plaque for being Teacher of the Year one day and get handed their pink slip the next day. It makes absolutely no sense whatsoever. And it makes no sense to the parents, it makes no sense to the kids, it makes no sense for the teachers. So think about this, if you are a young person in college right now trying to determine what profession you're going into, why would you ever want to choose a profession in which if you go into it and if you knock it out of the park and you are just seeing huge gains in student achievement with your kids, that would not matter one iota when it came to how much you got paid, whether you had to keep your job or not. It just doesn't make sense. That's not the kind of environment that young folks are going to want to go into. So if we're going to change the teaching profession, if we're going to be able to recruit and retain the best in that profession, we have to set it with what we say. We have to elevate the teaching profession. We have to know that teachers matter. They are not interchangeable widgets that you can just pull one out and put another one in and it's not going to make a difference. It absolutely makes a difference. We know this based on research, that the number one in-school factor that determines student achievement growth is the quality of teacher that's in the front of the kids every single day.
So just to be clear, you are not advocating asking Kobe Bryant and LeBron James to teach elementary school, but rather to pay excellent teachers.
That's exactly right.
Just checking. Now, Kat Shea, you are a charter school teacher. You are in the classroom. You see this yourself. Talk a little bit about what you just heard from Michelle Rhee, what makes sense and what doesn't. Talk a little bit about your experience inside the classroom and how that affects what you hear.
Just to give you guys a little background, I'm a volunteer teacher assistant at Camino Nuevo Charter Academy in Burlington. A big part of that reason was because I've been thinking about going into the teaching profession since high school, and the first thing that scares me is knowing how to manage a classroom. So I figured, why not do that out of my free time in college and get away with it, essentially. And so far it's working out pretty well, so just to give you guys a little bit of background. But I see two things that come from what you said. The first one is knowing from what my mother does. My mother helps run budgets in school districts. You cannot get anything passed in terms of government unless you have some CTA backing. And I think that, like, when we're talking about, whatever it is that frustrates us in terms of education policy or just any particular policy you can think of, you need to have CTA backing. And I think that's where we see this sort of push and pull force, and that's where we see some sort of frustration in this sort of movement of where we want to see our education, right? And so that's the first thing that I see governance. The second thing is I was a field representative at the Department of Ed in DC. And something that I noticed from the meetings and conferences that I attended was that teachers and those who are in commissions and policymakers, they're put in separate rooms. And so when we're talking about moving forward with policy, why are they not sitting at the same table? That not only should we elevate these teachers in terms of teacher pay and pension and how long they can actually have their tenure, but also making sure that effective teachers, they're at those policy tables. Just take that one step further. And the fact that they were just in separate rooms, I don't think that just happens in the U.S. Department of Ed. I'm sure that happens in a lot of other places. I haven't seen it in other places, but that's from my personal experience so far. And for me, being in the classroom to also being in those meeting rooms, there should be a connection, and I'm not seeing that right now. And I think that our policies would move in a certain direction if we combine the two together.
Okay. So Haran, we've talked about reform in a number of different ways, and what we've left off the table, except just in passing, are the difficult, hard, cold budgetary facts that a school or a district or a state faces when trying to figure out how to take on these challenges. We've talked about this before, but years ago I worked on a study out of Stanford University called Getting Down to Facts. And we asked school administrators, school principals, superintendents, and so on, if they had a choice, would they want more money for their schools or school districts? Or would they want more freedom and more flexibility from state regulation? And many of them, most of our respondents, called us out on that. They said that's not fair. You can't ask us to choose one or the other. But if you're going to force us in a totally unfair, nasty, mean-spirited way, don't get us wrong, we want the money, but we'd rather have the flexibility to spend that money as we think is most appropriate for our own schools and our own communities' needs. Talk a little bit, if you will, and it's an unpleasant topic, and we'll make the rest of these guys talk about it a little bit later. Talk a little bit about school budgeting, particularly, I know you've had some thoughts on Governor Brown's thought about moving money and decision-making responsibility from the state to the local level.
So, starting off with Governor Brown's local funding idea, I think everyone can agree with his basic premise that teaching in Compton is tougher than teaching in Santa Monica or Beverly Hills, and that more money is needed. However, we have to look at how that money is being given, where that money is coming from, and how long that money is going to be given without strings attached. And I think that kind of comes back to the fundamental issue of accountability, of how long can we, look to increase tax revenue to fund education systems that aren't necessarily working, and at what point we have to put benchmarks in to pull out that funding if schools are not delivering on that. And so we give them larger flexibility, we give them more funding, but we also have to ask them to show the results, kind of similar to what Race to the Top has been doing in terms of competition and in terms of benchmarks. And I think another issue, I'm kind of going to be the evil guy here. We talked about teacher pay. California is the 4th highest in teacher pay in the country, behind only New York, Connecticut, and Massachusetts. We're the lowest or second to lowest in terms of per student spending. And so we have to look also at where you're allocating spending. Yes, it's important to pay teachers, but if you're not spending that money on resources for the students, if you're not delegating those funds in a responsible way, if you're simply acquiescing to demands of teacher unions and people in bureaucracy and not really putting students first, not putting parents first, at what point do you have to pull the funding to kind of wake people up and say, this isn't the way to run a bureaucracy, this isn't the way to run your schools? And so I think it's hard questions both on a revenue and on a spending side in terms of where you go with the budget.
Okay. And Michelle, once again, we talked earlier about false choices, and this seems to me is a fairly important false choice, one between more money and more reform. One of the other things our Getting Down to Facts study showed was that widespread agreement between education experts, almost 24 experts from the left to the right, all ideologies, agreeing that California's public schools were in need of additional financial resources. The study also showed that if you did not change the way the money was spent, if you did not implement reforms in a state budget that comes up to just about $100 billion every year, if you didn't change the way money was spent in California, it would require an additional $1 trillion in spending simply to bring California up to the national average.
Yeah.
So it is a false choice. Reform money, talk about how
Yeah.
the two
I
integrate
mean,
and encourage each other.
So what is interesting is that it doesn't matter where you go in this country. If you go to a school board meeting in a city around February, which is when budget time is, you will hear the same conversations and arguments happen over and over and over again. Basically, what people are saying is we need more money in order to fix the system, in order to get better, outcomes. We need more money. In fact, I was just in Newark, New Jersey the other day. They were having that conversation. They spend $22,000 per kid per year in Newark, New Jersey, and that does not count Mark Zuckerberg's $100 million of Facebook money. And yet they're having the same conversation there as they are having in states where they're spending $5,000 a kid. And the reason why is because there is no transparency as to where these dollars are going and what kind of return on investment we are getting. And having been the superintendent of a large urban school district that spent more money than almost any other city in the country, I can tell you that more money does not always equal better outcomes. We were the worst performing school district in the entire nation. And quite frankly, if we wouldn't have changed, to Dan's point, there's an order of operation of things that need to happen. And if people think that the first thing to do is pour the money in, I would say that is actually not the case. Now, I'm not saying that more money isn't necessary at some point down the line. But if you have a dysfunctional, broken system and you pour more money into it, you will get no better outcomes whatsoever, because nobody knows where those dollars are being spent. We spent $1 billion a year on public education in Washington, D.C., $1 billion. And of that $1 billion, 403 million of it went into the schools and the classroom. That means that the majority of the dollars were going to fund this bloated bureaucracy of people filling out forms and creating pamphlets and what have you, with having absolutely no impact on kids. So if you would have poured more money into that system without changing it, you would have had more pamphlets and more of this and more of that, but you wouldn't have had better student outcomes. So I actually think that now that we are having the financial crisis in this country that we are, and there is no more money at this point in time, now is the time to fix the fundamentals of the system so that when we get to a better economic place and we do have more dollars flowing in, they will result in a different outcome.
I am dying to ask the rest of our panelists to weigh in on this topic also. But I also recognize that many of you have been sitting here very patiently and probably have some thoughts that you'd like to share. What I'm going to do before I open up to questions is just offer you a couple of reminders. Number one, of course, we'd like that your thought be framed in a question as opposed to a statement. Second, that you tell us who you are. So when you're called on, we know who we're talking to. I think third and most importantly, and those of you who've attended our events in the past, you know how importantly we take this. If you're going to ask a question, particularly of someone with whom you disagree, we ask that you frame that question with the same level of respect and regard that you hope that person would show to you if they were disagreeing with something that you said. So got that, Bonnie? We're going to do it better this time. Who has questions for any or all of our panelists? Questions? Yes, you are? The question, if everyone over here didn't hear it, is first, tell me your name again, I'm sorry?
Catherine.
First, Catherine congratulated the panel on the brilliance of their presentation. She said they were absolutely fascinating, and Catherine, I have to agree with you. I was that said, they look a little bit embarrassed by all that lavish praise, so in retrospect, you probably shouldn't have done it. Well, what's done is done. And she then went on to ask what college students can do to get involved in this debate and help affect education reform, whether, if you don't mind me paraphrasing, Catherine, whether it's the type of reform that our panelists are advocating or other types of priorities and changes that they think are important. And Ben, I'm going to start with you on this one. Your job is empowering parents, bringing parents into a conversation that historically hasn't made a lot of room for them. How do college students get involved in that same conversation?
Yeah. Thanks again for lavishing us with praise. First of all, I think it's important to recognize that this issue is different from most others. If you graduate from college and you want to get involved in something that's going to have a systemic impact on social change for a generation, as we all know, politics in Washington, D.C. and in Sacramento and in many of the school districts that we deal with are pretty calcified. And in most issues, Democrats have one position, Republicans have another position, and it's going to be hard to make a big impact in a way that is going to affect a lot of people. Education and education reform is different in this moment in time. I had been doing this for a little while, and in 2001, I was a deputy mayor for former Mayor Dick Reardon. There was a big battle over control of the school board. And what that battle was really about, if you boil it down, it was about a new reading program for third graders. The battles that are going on now are about fundamental questions like who is going to have power over public education and what is the American classroom, what's the LAUSD classroom going to look like in the 21st century. These are exciting questions, they are unanswered questions, and they're questions that everybody in this room can play a role in answering. And so I think, first of all, deciding to get involved in the education reform movement when you graduate or before you graduate is a great decision because it's one of the few issues where you can make a big impact, you can see the impact you're making, and you can play a role in the paradigm shift that's going on right now in real time. As it relates to the work we're doing, as Dan said, our goal is to take power away from or to transfer power from the sort of elite folks who hold power right now in big district bureaucracies and transfer them to parents, but also to the community. There are, through the Parent Trigger movement, there are a lot of ways in which folks in this room can get involved by supporting the work the parents are doing just a few miles from here. There are, Michelle has both Parent Revolution and Students First have a whole lot of different volunteer opportunities that, range from writing a letter to a school board member to interning and really learning what's happening in real time. So I would encourage everybody to get involved, both because you can make a difference and because this issue, unlike other issues, is an issue that sort of crosses partisan lines, and I think everybody on the left and the right are looking for new solutions to our failed system.
And what I'd say quickly, just to add to Ben's point, is in addition to Ben and Michelle, there are representatives of both Students First and Parent Revolution here today. And so at the conclusion of today's program, should you have an interest in getting involved in one or both of the organizations, after you purchase one of Michelle's books and get her to sign it, we'll make sure that some of Ben and Michelle's colleagues are around also for you to engage in conversation and find out a little bit more about the next steps. Who else has questions for our panelists? Yes, all the way in back.
Good afternoon. Thank you, first of all, for a wonderful panel. Really appreciate it. My name is Justin Tindingen, and I'm a Bay Area 2009 Teach for America alum, and currently a master's student at the High School of Public Policy in my first year for my master's in public policy. My question is mainly directed towards Michelle Reed, however anyone can answer if they feel like they can. But my question is, because you're based mainly in Sacramento, and because of my recent transplant from Northern California to Southern California, what do you think are the major differences between the two areas, if there are any?
Well, great question. Michelle, both in terms, I guess I would reframe it slightly. Either in terms of educational quality or in terms of prospect for the types of education reform we've been talking about. You talked about the difference between California and the rest of the country. Are there differences in that regard between Northern and Southern California?
So when I founded Students First 2 years ago, and we were trying to figure out where to headquarter the organization, I've always wanted to live in Chicago, so I sort of thought about that. There was DC, which is where I was at the moment, and my husband said to me, "You got to come to the belly of the beast, baby." He basically said, there is no city that represents the status quo bureaucracy not wanting to move like Sacramento. And so if you're going to bring about massive change through mobilizing everyday people to focus on this issue, if you can do it here, then it just cracks everything open. And so we did.
Side benefit, you get to be with
And I get to live in the same house as my husband. Yes, that's a good point. So we headquartered in Sacramento. I recruited people from all across the country. They're now in Sacramento. And one of the things that I will say, sort of looking at our state legislature in Sacramento versus leaders here in Southern California, I would say that there's a huge difference. If you just look at Mayor Antonio Villaraigosa, this guy is somebody, he's an icon of the Democratic Party, obviously, but his willingness to step out on this issue and not just take bold stands, but bold actions, has set reverberations throughout the country, throughout the Democratic Party. It has just been amazing to watch that happen. You juxtapose that to, there is absolutely no leadership in the legislature right now that is willing to take a stand in education. I talk to legislators all the time who say, behind closed doors, I'm with you. I get it. It's not that I don't understand, and I know it's my kids in our community, but to the point over here, but the CTA will be mad at me, and then they'll do this and the other. So the fact that there is some leadership here in Southern California and other parts of California that's willing to take a bold stand, that's the main difference to me between what's happening at the Capitol in Sacramento and what's happening in other places.
Other questions? Yes, right here.
Oh, hi. My name is Ben Robinson. I'm also a first-year Master of Public Policy student. So what we're taught to do as policy students is to look at a value neutral, for the most part, value neutral look at what works and what doesn't work in anything that we're looking at. So a lot of the times people will say, oh, last in, first out doesn't make sense to me conceptually. It doesn't make sense. But you're putting that as forth as something that's like you don't agree with it. And it's part of your scorecard. So my question is, should we be looking more at results?
Yeah.
What works with results?
Yeah.
And how do we know? So last in,
Right.
first out may sound
Right.
conceptually wrong,
Right.
but how do we know that it's not working?
Okay.
And real quick, Michelle, just for those who might not have heard, Ben asks, I think, a fascinating question about the student's first report card, and should it be used to measure education progress on education reform, and use last in, first out as an example, or should it be used to measure student achievement?
So here's the quick answer. We don't advocate for last in, first out because it sounds good. I mean, it does sound good. Like it makes common sense, so that's a good thing. But that's not the only reason why. Last in, first out has 3 very significant detrimental impacts on kids. The first is this: if you look at the list of teachers who get laid off when you're implementing a last in, first out seniority-based layoff versus a quality-based layoff, just based on teacher effectiveness, there's only a 15% overlap. Which means that when you are laying teachers off solely by seniority, you are losing a lot of highly effective teachers. That is bad for children. There's no doubt about that. 1. 2, when you lay teachers off strictly by seniority, since junior teachers are paid a lot less money, it means you have to lay a whole lot more of them off in order to meet the budget, to fill the budget hole, which means more classrooms are being disrupted. In fact, if you were to do a quality-based layoff instead of a seniority-based layoff, you could save 30% of the jobs in an average layoff. And the third, and probably what is closest to my heart, is that it disproportionately negatively impacts poor and minority kids. Why? Because the seniority-based layoffs typically happen at the district level. Who are the least senior teachers in the district, right? Poor performing schools typically have the largest number of new teachers. High performing schools in affluent parts of town, they're very desirable places to go. When people go there, they probably never leave, which means that the most junior teacher there has 8 years of experience. So when the layoffs come, the low performing schools in the inner city are decimated. They can lose 40 to 50% of their staff, and the high performing schools are untouched by the budget cuts. That is not fair for kids. This is not an opinion that I have. These are the facts. And the problem with the fact that we have facts is that when you go to the teachers union and you ask them, like, well, given this, like, why do you do it? What they'll say to you in their honest moments is, because we actually think it's the most fair way to do it, which actually makes sense for their members. That, for their members and trying to figure out who's gonna get laid off, that might be the right way to do it. They might be correct. But we happen to know that for kids, that is absolutely not the right way to do it. And therein sort of lies we know that they're gonna advocate for their members and what's best for them. They should do that, that's their job. Who's gonna advocate for the kids and what's best for them?
We got time for just a couple more questions. Jackie?
I am a former student of USC. I graduated here, and I now work with an organization called Students Matter that has launched a lawsuit in the state of California to address sort of the legislative inaction towards education reform. So, Mr. Austin, Ms. Reed, can you talk about litigation as a tool for pursuing education reform here and in other states?
The question is about moving reform not through legislation, but rather through litigation. And Ben and Michelle will both address this briefly so we can cram in at least one more question after you finish. Ben?
Sure, just very, very quickly, the parent trigger had to be litigated. The parents of Desert Trails Elementary School, the first school in the history of America to win a parent trigger campaign, had to win not one, but 2 lawsuits against their own school district to force them to comply with the law and give them the power to transform their failing school. And so, it is, litigation is a powerful tool because judges don't take campaign contributions. That is, I think that the Students Matter lawsuit is an interesting one. Parent Revolution has signed on to it, mainly because there are, whether or not provisions like Michelle just described are unconstitutional, we'll find out. But one way or the other, an impartial judge will decide, and the defenders of the status quo are going to have to defend what they're talking about in court. Very, very, very quickly, I heard David Boies give a talk recently about the Prop 8 litigation, about gay marriage. And his point that I think resonated for me in the context of education reform lawsuits was that Prop 8 passed in California because in a political campaign you can basically say whatever you want. But in a courtroom, you have to comply. I'm an untalented lawyer, but a lawyer nonetheless. That's why I do this job. But in a courtroom, you have to comply with the rules of evidence. And so what he said was that what they basically did around gay marriage was put bigotry on trial, and bigotry lost. And in some ways, what some of these lawsuits are doing is putting the status quo on trial, and hopefully it loses more often than it wins.
Michelle?
Yeah, I mean, I think that especially in a state like California where there just isn't a lot of any momentum right now on the legislative track, should we be trying to do everything else through other routes that we can to try to promote some change? Absolutely, and I think the litigation strategy is a brilliant one from that standpoint. I do want to caution, though, that we can't litigate our way to success. Yeah. And what I mean by that is there are so many examples of places across the country where there have been successful cases because kids are not getting sort of an equitable education, et cetera, and what the court remedy is usually money of some sort, and if you actually track what happened to that money, where it got spent, and what the outcomes were, they just don't track at all. I mean, it doesn't result in better outcomes for kids, and that's, these judges, while impartial and they don't take campaign contributions and whatnot, they're also not education policy experts, so they're not probably going to be the ones who are going to determine a remedy that is truly going to systemically change the situation that we're in.
We've got time for one last question, so we'll make this the lightning round in the back.
Hi, my name is Kaya Messler. I want to just go back to your comments about the legislature not moving forward on this because they can call back the CTA. I know your organization has been involved in a few assembly races. I was wondering if you see those people, like Cheryl Brown and Amy Calderon, as people that are going to maybe take the first step, or if you just work with other reasons.
So for those who didn't hear the question, Kaya said, in addition to legislation, in addition to litigation, there's a political avenue as well. And Students First has been involved in a small number of legislative races.
Yeah.
Michelle, maybe you can talk about that.
Yeah, so we see the solution in the long term to be, how do we create a majority in the legislature that actually will vote for reform, right? We are a long ways away from that right now, but you have to start somewhere. So for us, it was getting involved in those two races. Now, what can we expect for that? Well, we put a few $100,000 into races. We actually won some of them and we're very sort of happy and successful about that. That's not going to change the dynamic in Sacramento overnight. What it is going to do, though, is create a dynamic where you now have some moderate moderate Democrats who have been elected on a pro-education reform platform, who may then use their political capital not to get something passed, but to say, okay, I'm going to introduce a bill, or I'm going to use the political capital that I have to make sure that this bill has a hearing, right? Those are the first steps. When you can build a cadre so that it's 2 the first year and then maybe it's 5 the second year, you'll get to a critical mass where there are people that are in the legislature now who wouldn't right now vote for an education reform bill, but if they saw some of their colleagues moving in that direction, they know what's right. They know what's right for their kids and their constituents, so they could be moved, right? And then maybe you'd have to bring some other new ones in. So over time, over a 5 to 7 to 10 year period, is it possible, if you're really strategic, to create a critical mass such that you could get to a majority? We believe absolutely so. But it's about taking one step at a time.
In just one moment, I'm going to ask you to join me in thanking our panelists, but before I do, I want to go back to the question that Catherine asked at the beginning of this portion of the program about how a college student can get involved in a political reform, an education reform effort, whether it's the type advocated here or another that's perhaps more to your liking. Ben, I thought, gave a phenomenal answer. I'll just add one point to it. 2 of my former students work for Students First. 2 of my former students work for Parent Revolution. Jackie works at Student Matter. Every single, and we would have appreciated a question rather than a demonstration, but we're happy to have you here. Whether you happen to agree with this form of advocate of this type of reform or not, I think what hopefully you learn is it's very rare that a rally or a protest or a banner changes people's minds nearly as effectively as getting involved in the system of change. And whether it's Students First, whether it's Parent Revolution, whether it's the California Teacher Association or the National Education Association, the important thing is getting involved. Every one of those students who I mentored, who I had in my classes, every single one of those students, the way they got involved in this after graduation was by interning and taking a semester or a summer during their time, graduate or undergraduate, and giving even a couple afternoons a week to an organization like this one, or I think Ben and Michelle would agree with me, for an organization that they would vehemently disagree with. The important thing is getting involved. We at the Jess Underwood Institute of Politics, we offer an internship class, Poli-Sci 395, and we are just beginning to place students for summer semester, and we're also more than happy to talk to you about fall. If you want to make change, the banners are helpful. Getting inside those rooms where the decisions are made, learning how to advocate for whatever your version, your brand of reform is ultimately the way to make change happen. Couple of quick announcements. Number one, as I mentioned earlier, Michelle Reed's memoir, Radical Fighting to Put Students First, is available for purchase. She will be signing books at the table, clearly not to my left, to your left. If you're still hungry, you can go to my left. If you'd like to get a book, go to your left. The next Students Talk Back discussion will focus on local governance in this room 1 week from today, but 2 weeks from today, we'll be talking about the results of the primary for Los Angeles mayor with local political experts. So we hope you'll come next week for the conversation on local governance, but 2 weeks from today for the conversation on the mayoral campaign. And then finally, the deadline to apply for one of the other institute's scholarships and awards for summer internships is Wednesday, March 27th at 5 p.m. If you're interested, please come to our offices in DKC 263. But what these awards and scholarships do is they provide a stipend for housing, for transportation, for tuition for students looking to intern over the summer, whether it's in Washington, whether it's in Sacramento, here in LA or elsewhere. Some students have their expenses fully funded, others partially funded. But if you are thinking about interning this summer, and if you are not much wealthier than I am, then let us know, and we'll steer you toward the process of applying for one of our scholarships. All that said, please join me in thanking our panel, Kat Shea, Alexa Hackman, Ben Austin, and Michelle Reed, for a terrific conversation. Thanks as well to our partners at the Rivera Institute, the Bedrosian Center, and the Schwarzenegger Institute for their involvement in this program every week. Thank you. And finally, thanks to the Underwood Institute staff, Laura Hill, Steve Wynn, and Brennan Hidalgo, and Chris Nelson, for our student workers for all their great work. Thank you very much.